So first one we're going to be working on is we're going to be working on solving our quadratic functions, our quadratic equations. We've done those before. So our first method is what we refer to as extracting the roots. You may not know it by that term, but you guys generally do know how to solve these ones. So here I have x squared equals 16. So what I want to do is I want to take the square root of both sides so I can get just my x. So over here on the left side we get x, but over here on the right side what do we get? Oh, not 4, not just 4. Plus or minus 4. Because remember, we could take a positive 4, square it, and you would get 16. But we could also take a negative 4, square it, and you would still get 16. So that's why when you take the square root, you get two answers. You get positive 4 and you get negative 4. So that's our answer for that one, x equals plus or minus 4. Now number 2, though, we have an x cubed, so it's a little bit different. You would want to take the cube root of both sides. Since it was an exponent of 3, that means we're taking our cube root. So now we're left with x. And then we just got to figure out what is the cube root of 8. It wouldn't be plus or minus this time. It would just be 2. Because it's an odd number, you would be multiplying that 2 3 times. It doesn't work for negative. Negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2 would be negative 8. So the plus or minus only shows up when you have the even exponents, not when you have the odd. So this just is x equals 2. So there's that one. We've done solve by factoring before. When we did our factoring earlier this year so far, a lot of you tried to finish solving it afterwards. You didn't have to at that point. Now we do. So here we have a trinomial factor. So we set up our two sets of parentheses. What multiplies to give us 12, but would give us a 4 in the middle. 2 and 6. Our 6 would be our negative, to give you that negative 4 in the middle. Again, you should kind of be checking in your head. Little smile would give negative 6. Big smile would give you a positive 2. So negative 6 plus 2 gives us our negative 4. And you got to make sure you keep writing that equals 0 over there. That's a notation thing that you have to make sure you keep doing. So now we set them both equal to 0. X equals 6 equals 0. X plus 2 equals 0. And then we solve it. So we would get 6 and negative 2. Now since it's not a fraction, there's nothing that we have to check. It's just 6 and negative 2. So let's take a look at our number 2. So again, we're going to factor. So I'm going to set up my two sets of parentheses. Instead of x and x this time, what will we have? Yep, so x squared and x squared. What multiplies to give us 8? 2 and 4. What are our signs going to be? Both negative. So now what I'm actually going to do, instead of factoring x squared minus 4 again, I'm just going to go ahead and set it equal to 0. Same thing with my x squared minus 2. Set that equal to 0. So then I'm going to add my 4 over. So I get x squared equals 4. Take our square root and we get x equals what? Plus or minus 2. So then for the other side, we would add our 2 over, so I get x squared equals a positive 2. Take the square root of both sides, and we would just get x equals plus or minus the square root of 2. So we have 4 answers for that one. We have positive 2, negative 2, positive radical 2, and negative radical 2. Your hint also that we were going to have 4 answers is back at the beginning, our largest exponent was our 4. So that was kind of our hint. We were going to have 4 answers there. see our quadratic formula. You guys all remember quadratic formula? Know it, love it. The nice thing about the quadratic formula is what? It's given to you on your Regents exam. Yay! So that one you don't have to have memorized. What you do have to remember, it talks about A, B's, and C's. So in our quadratic equation here, our A is the 2. That's the one that's in front of your x squared. Our B is a what? What number? Yes, B is 4. And C is a 1. So let's go ahead and plug that into our formula. So x equals negative b, so that's going to be a negative 4. My b value is a 4, and I need to make it negative. Plus or minus. And then I get my square root sign in there. B squared, so 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times 1 minus 4 AC. 4 times 2 times 1. And then it's all over 2 times 2, all over my 2a. So let's clean this up. What is 4 squared minus 4 times 2 times 1? Let's do it first. What's 4 squared? 16. And then 4 times 2 times 1 is 8. And then that's all over 4. So then 16 minus 8 gives us an 8 there. So now we got to simplify that radical. So I always kind of like to step out over to the side. What's our perfect square that goes into 8? Yep, 4. And then 2. So the square root of 4 is 2. And then I keep my radical 2 there. So now I'm going to take this and plug it in for that radical 8. So I have negative 4 plus or minus 2 radical 2 all over 4. So the last thing, we got to reduce if we can. These 3 numbers outside of the radical, can I reduce those? Yeah, what can we divide those all by? 2. So we get negative 2 plus or minus 1 radical 2 over 2. And that's our final answer. Now sometimes what the Regents might do if it's a multiple choice question is they like to separate it for some reason. So they would put negative 2 over 2 plus or minus radical 2 over 2. So they kind of make it 2 fractions instead of the 1. But even then they would have to reduce it. So this would become negative 1 plus or minus, and then they like to write it as 1/2 radical 2. That is the same thing as that. You have to be able to know how to split it apart for your Regents exam so that you can recognize that it's the same thing. Alright, let's take a look at the next one. Completing the square. Completing the square is actually one of my personal favorites when it comes to solving quadratics. I think it goes a little faster than especially the quadratic formula does. So with completing the square, does anybody remember what we have to do first? We've got to add that 15 over to the other side. So anything that has an x stays on one side. 15 goes to the other side. And then what we do is we put in a space. So I have x squared minus 2x plus a space equals 15 plus a space. Sometimes you use box, other teachers use boxes. I don't like to confine my writing to a small box, so I just use a space. So now to get the number that we're going to put on the line, we have to take this number here in front of x, divide it by 2. So negative 2 divided by 2 gives us what? Negative 1. And then we square that. And that gives us 1. So that goes here. 1 and then 1. So now we're going to factor this left side over here. It's a trinomial. So we're going to have x and x. And your little hint when you're doing completing the square, whatever this number was before you squared it is what it's going to be when you factor. So those would just both be x minus 1, x minus 1. It's the way it always works in completing the square. That's going to equal 16. So we want to rewrite this as x minus 1 squared equals 16. Take the square root of both sides. So we just have x minus 1 on the left. On the right, we get plus or minus 4. And then we just have to add our 1 over. I'll go up over here. So we have x equals 1 plus or minus 4. Bless you. So for our two answers, 1 plus 4 would give us a 5. And then 1 minus 4 would give us a negative 3. So 5 and negative 3 are our two answers for that one. That's our completing the square. So now sometimes in problems, you just want to put that over 1 so you can cross multiply. You now have a fraction equaling a fraction, so you can go ahead and cross multiply that. So I would do x times 3x plus 19 equals 40. So then distribute our x here. I get 3x squared plus 19x equals 40. So then because we have this x squared here, that's kind of our hint. We're going to have to factor or quadratic formula or something. So I'm going to bring my 40 over so that it is equal to 0. Sadly, our completing the square is not an option here because you have a number in front of your x squared. It has to be just a 1 there. It can't be a 3 or a 2 or anything else. It has to be a 1 in order to do completing the square. So that's not an option. Do we want to try factoring? All right, let's try factoring, see if that's going to work. Nope, there's not a GCF because 19's prime. There's no numbers that go into 19 other than 19 and 1. So let's see, we got 3x and x. Let's try factoring. What multiplies to give us 40? We got 4 and 10. 8 and 5. We got 2 and 20. Let's see here. If we do 8 and 5, if I put my 8 over there, what I'm thinking in my head is as I do my big smile, that would give me a 24x if I make that positive. Little smile, that would give me a negative 5x if I make that negative. So if I combine those, what do we get? We get our 19x. That's our middle term. So this one was factorable. So again, that little smile, big smile, you got to be doing those things in your head. So now we just got to set them equal to 0. So 3x minus 5 equals 0, x plus 8 equals 0. So one of my answers is negative 8. I always do that one first because that one's a little easier. The other side, I'm going to add my 5 over. And then divide by 3. So our other answer would be x equals 5/3. You don't want to turn that into the repeating decimal. Leave that one as the fraction 5/3. All right. So some harder ones where we're extracting the roots. See, these ones, when you look at them, a lot of people, what they try to start doing is they take the x plus 2, they write it twice, multiply everything out, combine your like terms, and then they try to factor. That's just a really, really long way of doing it. This is already set up to look like completing the square. They're kind of like in a middle step of completing the square there. Yep. So we want to add the 16 over. And then we want to undo that square, so we'll take the square root of both sides. Remember, that turns it into a plus or minus 4. And then subtract our 2 over. So I get x equals -2 plus or minus 4, and then we can actually figure out our answers from there. If I do -2 plus 4, that would give me a 2. And then a -2 minus 4 would give us a what? -6. So that's the much easier way of doing it than multiplying everything out. It's that you have to recognize it's kind of like a middle step for completing the square that they've given you. So the same thing is true for number 2. It's kind of like a middle step for completing the square here. So we want to add our 6 over first. So I get 2 times x minus 1 squared equals 6. Before we take the square root, though, we still need to divide by the 2. You need to have the x minus 1 squared entirely on its own. You can't have any numbers around the outside of the parentheses. So that's why we got to divide by the 2 first. And so now we want to take the square root. So we got x minus 1, bless you, equals plus or minus the square root of 3. So then add our 1 over, and we get 1 plus or minus radical 3. That would be our final answer. All right, then we got just a few more to practice on the back. So for number 3, got my parentheses on its own with the exponent out there. Instead of a square root this time, what do I want to take? Cube root, because it's to the 3rd power. So I'm going to take a cube root. Now again, since it's a cube root, we don't do the plus or minus. Just what is the cube root of 8? 2. So then adding my 4 over, we would just get x equals 6. Because 2 plus 4 gives us 6. All right, what do we want to do first in number 4? Very good, you guys. Add the 1. So I get x plus 3 to the 5th equals 32. So which root am I going to use? The 5th root. Good. Does anybody happen to remember what the 5th root of 32 is? Do you guys remember how to use your calculator to find it? You got to push the 5, and then you push math, choice 5, and then you're 32. Yeah, 5th root of 32 is 2. And then subtract our 3 over. So we get x equals -1. Alright, then we got few more. So we're going back to our factoring, only we're using our factoring by grouping. Again, we know to factor by grouping because we have how many terms? 4. That's always your hint. You're going to factor by grouping is you got 4 terms. So group the first 2, group my last 2. What's our GCF in the first 2? Very good. So I pull out my x squared, I'm left with x plus 2. What's our GCF for the second set? Very good, -9. And the one thing people keep forgetting, when I pull out that -9, my 18 now turns to positive, so it still becomes x plus 2. So those match. So now I'm going to pull my x plus 2 out in front. And then I write what's left in the other set of parentheses, so the x squared minus 9. We could do dots, or we could just set it equal to 0 as it is, add our 9, and then take the square root of both sides. So one of our answers would be x equals -2. On the other side, we would add our 9, take the square root. So we would get x equals plus or minus 3. So there's our 3 answers. Again, our largest exponent at the beginning was a 3. So that means we're going to have 3 answers, and we found all 3 of them. -2, +3, and -3. All right, let's try our next one. Again, group the first 2, group the last 2. What's our GCF within the first 2? X squared. So that gives me x minus 1. Our GCF within the last 2? -3, yep. So then we get x minus 1. Because remember, when I divide that by the -3, it gives me that -1 there. So now I'm going to pull out my x minus 1. I'm left with x squared minus 3. So let's set those equal to 0. So I get, and 1 is one of my answers. And then our other answer should be plus or minus the square root of 3. Now the third one, they've actually already started your grouping for you. They did that first part already. So if you look at your 2 parentheses, those are the same. So I pull that out in front. And my second parenthesis would be the x plus 7. So they already started the grouping for you. You just have to finish it up. So 2x plus 1 equals 0. X plus 7 equals 0. So we get -7 and -1/2 is our 2 answers there. All right, so I'm going to give you a minute. I want you to try the fourth one on your own. See if you can get it started. This one you ended up having to do another factor in there. You had to do a GCF factor here with your x squared minus 2x. You had to take out an x. So one of our answers is x equals 0. Another one of our answers would just be x equals 2. And then our fourth answer is actually something we haven't done yet. We're going to do that in our next mini unit that we're going to do after this one. It ended up being a plus or minus the square root of -1, which you guys can't do yet.